Inside the Tang clan's manor, the quiet ambiance of Tang Jie's private chambers was broken only by the soft clink of porcelain as she sipped her tea. The elegant room, adorned with fine tapestries and delicate furnishings, reflected her position within the clan. Yet her thoughts were far from the serenity that surrounded her. Her mind lingered on her son, Yeon-Myeong, as a gnawing sense of unease settled over her. Was Yeon-Myeong safe? The question echoed in her heart, the faintest flicker of anxiety clouding her normally composed expression. However, the stillness was abruptly shattered when the door to her room burst open. Wanjin, the captain of the Bongwi Brigade, appeared at the threshold, his usually stern face twisted in urgency. His presence, unannounced and unexpected, struck a discordant note in the room, bringing with it a sense of impending disaster. He was breathless, his hurried steps and disheveled appearance betraying the severity of the situation. Tang Jihei's calm facade crumbled as the weight of his report settled in. Her chest tightened, her thoughts racing as the revelation sank in. The Tang clan was under attack. The Black Death Alliance, a force of ruthless warriors, had invaded the Tang family's territory. The very walls that once stood as a symbol of strength and security were now being threatened by an overwhelming enemy. Her fingers gripped the delicate teacup, knuckles whitening as her thoughts spiraled toward her son. Yeon-Myeong, the name echoed in her mind, a silent cry of desperation. Tang Jie's expression darkened, a mixture of fear and fury flashing across her face as she realized the gravity of the threat closing in on their family. At the heart of the Black Death Alliance's quarter, the sound of clashing steel reverberated through the air as Yeon-Myeong launched a relentless barrage of attacks. His blade, honed through years of training and sharpened by sheer determination, sliced through the air with lethal precision. Each strike carried the weight of his intent, aiming to overwhelm his opponent. Yet, despite the fury behind his blows, Yu Giljun remained unmoved. His hands, seemingly casual in their movement, deflected each attack with ease, as if swatting away a mere nuisance. The gap in their abilities became glaringly evident. No matter how fierce or fast Yeon-Myeong's strikes came, they failed to break through Yu Giljun's defense. Frustration gnawed at him as his blade met only air or the impenetrable wall of Yu Giljun's effortless parries. His every move was precise, calculated, but none of it mattered in the face of his opponent's sheer skill. Yu Giljun, despite being on the receiving end of this ceaseless onslaught, appeared calm, almost indifferent. His sharp gaze followed Yeon-Myeong's every motion, studying the technique behind the attacks as if reading an open book. There was a sense of quiet superiority in his movements, an unspoken acknowledgement that he had seen through Yeon-Myeong's every strategy. To him, these sword techniques, no matter how impressive, were beneath what he had already mastered. His brother's sword skills paled in comparison, and now he found himself measuring Yeon-Myeong's abilities in real time. Yeon-Myeong, unable to land even a single hit, felt the weight of his opponent's scrutiny. With every failed strike, his frustration mounted. The clash between them was no longer just a battle of swords, it had become a battle of wills, one in which Yeon-Myeong was beginning to falter. Desperation began to creep in as he realized Yu Giljun was not only blocking his attacks but dissecting them, as if analyzing each flaw and weakness. Driven by a fierce resolve to turn the tide, Yeon-Myeong pushed his body to its limit. His movements became a blur, faster and more aggressive than before, as he attempted to outpace Yu Giljun's defenses. He swung with renewed speed, aiming to strike before his opponent could react. But even this newfound burst of speed did nothing to close the gap between them. Yu Giljun's effortless blocks continued, the gulf between their abilities widening with each passing moment. The futility of the situation weighed heavily on Yeon-Myeong. His every effort met with the cold, unyielding truth of his opponent's dominance. Despite his best efforts, Yu Giljun remained untouchable, his defense impenetrable, as though the very laws of battle bent to his will. Yu Giljun's calm demeanor remained unshaken as he meticulously analyzed Yeon-Myeong's movements, his eyes narrowing in quiet contemplation. Although Yeon-Myeong's relentless attacks appeared relentless and precise, something about the swordsmanship felt unnatural, almost too perfect. It was as if the blade followed an optimized path, one designed to eliminate any opponent with flawless efficiency. Yu Giljun's keen senses picked up on this strange pattern, a subtle anomaly that made him pause in his assessment. The sword's movements were calculated, deliberate, but there was something deeper. Something that spoke of a refined technique beyond mere skill. As if sensing Yu Giljun's growing understanding, a flicker of tension rippled through Yeon-Myeong's posture. The battle had already stretched his limits, yet now it seemed his opponent was not only deflecting his strikes, but unraveling the very core of his technique. The weight of that realization hung heavy, even as Yeon-Myeong fought to suppress the mounting frustration. In a swift, calculated motion, Yu Giljun launched his counterattack. His hand, now transforming into a vicious dragon claw, slashed through the air with terrifying speed and precision, aimed directly at Yeon-Myeong's eyes. The attack, sudden and brutal, carried an air of inevitability, as if Yu Giljun had already predicted the outcome. His opponent's youth and talent were remarkable, but Yu Giljun's experience and mastery were on an entirely different level. Yet, in that critical instant, Yeon-Myeong's instincts took over. With a sharp reflex, he swung his sword in a desperate arc, the blade intercepting the dragon claw just before it could reach his face. The metallic ring of sword against claw echoed through the air as Yeon-Myeong narrowly deflected the strike, avoiding the fatal blow by a hair's breadth. His body moved on pure instinct, a surge of survival-driven momentum pushing him to evade what could have been a devastating injury. But Yu Giljun's assault did not end there. Undeterred by the failed attack on Yeon-Myeong's eyes, he seamlessly shifted his stance, his movements fluid and merciless. In the blink of an eye, he delivered a powerful kick that connected squarely with Yeon-Myeong's torso, sending him skidding backward across the ground. The sheer force of the impact left Yeon-Myeong reeling. His breath knocked from his lungs as he struggled to maintain his balance. Before he could be fully thrown back, Yeon-Myeong drove his sword into the earth, using it as an anchor to halt his retreat. His body lurched, his muscles straining against the momentum, but he managed to stop himself from being completely overwhelmed by the force of the kick. Yu Giljun gave no reprieve, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed as soon as Yeon-Myeong steadied himself. Without hesitation, he launched another attack, his dragon claw slicing through the air with lethal intent. This time, however, Yeon-Myeong was ready. He raised his sword just in time, blocking the blow with all his strength. The impact was immense, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. As their weapons collided, the very ground beneath them shattered into fragments, a testament to the destructive force of their clash. The battle between them raged on with a fury that left the Black Death Alliance's quarter crumbling into ruins. Their movements were too swift for untrained eyes to follow, blurs of motion that seemed almost beyond human capability. Both combatants, equal in skill and power, exchanged blows with deadly precision. Yeon-Myeong's sword met Yu Giljun's dragon claw again and again, each clash more devastating than the last, as debris scattered and walls collapsed around them. For what seemed like an eternity, the two warriors remained locked in a deadly dance, neither giving ground. But finally, after a series of attacks and counters, they momentarily paused, standing across from each other, both assessing the situation. Yu Giljun, with an air of confidence, surveyed his opponent with newfound respect. He hadn't anticipated such a fierce and evenly matched struggle. The fight, instead of being a simple display of dominance, had turned into a test of his own abilities, one that forced him to reevaluate the pinnacle of martial arts he believed he had reached. On the opposite end, Yeon-Myeong's mind raced, the intensity of the battle taking its toll. The sheer force and skill Yu Giljun demonstrated were undeniable. Each move not only a response to Yeon-Myeong's attacks, but also a methodical study of his technique. It was clear now that Yu Giljun was beginning to enjoy the fight, using it to push himself further, testing his own limits with each exchange. Yeon-Myeong, however, felt the weight of time pressing against him. The longer the fight dragged on, the more the balance would tip in Yu Giljun's favor. His eyes shifted to his blade, and a flicker of concern crossed his features. The venomous azure light technique, his most lethal weapon, wasn't manifesting its full potential, and he could feel the strain it was placing on his sword. The blade, finely crafted and honed to perfection, had miraculously endured the constant barrage of attacks, but Yeon-Myeong knew it couldn't hold out forever. The relentless force of the battle was pushing both him and his weapon to their limits. How much longer could the sword last? But before he could dwell further on his thoughts, Yu-Giljun struck again. Moving with blinding speed, he closed the distance in an instant, appearing right before Yeon-Myeong's eyes. The suddenness of it left Yeon-Myeong no time to think, only to react. Yu-Giljun's eyes flickered with disdain as he noticed Yeon-Myeong momentarily shift his focus, interpreting it as arrogance in the midst of their heated battle. Without hesitation, he launched a follow-up strike, this time channeling the power of his Black Death Palm technique. The force of the attack was devastating, landing squarely on Yeon-Myeong's body and sending him hurtling backward. The impact rattled through his frame. But even as he was pushed back, Yeon-Myeong swung his sword with fierce precision, desperate to break Yu-Giljun's momentum. The strategy worked. Yu-Giljun's advance was halted, and for a brief moment, a gap in his defenses appeared. Seizing the opportunity, Yeon-Myeong struck again, his blade flashing through the air with lethal intent. But to his shock, his sword found only empty space. His eyes widened in disbelief. He had missed. The realization settled like a heavy weight in his chest. Yu-Giljun had already anticipated his next move. Standing across from him, Yu-Giljun's expression darkened with a grim satisfaction. The missed strike only confirmed his growing dominance in the fight. He acknowledged Yeon-Myeong's skill, but the techniques the younger warrior relied on were insufficient against his mastery. Cheap martial arts, as Yu-Giljun saw it, had no place in this battle. With a cold resolve, he began to gather energy, focusing it into a single point at his fingertip. This was no ordinary technique. It was the culmination of his recent enlightenment, a technique designed to crush any opponent who dared stand before him. As the energy gathered, swirling with immense power, Yu-Giljun's intentions became clear. He had reached a new pinnacle in his martial arts, and he was eager to see how Yeon-Myeong would withstand this next assault. With a chilling calmness, he unleashed the energy in an explosion of raw power, the force of the subduing righteous divine art erupting directly in front of Yeon-Myeong. The blast was immense, tearing through the air with a deafening roar, and in that moment, the entire battlefield seemed to tremble under the might of Yu-Giljun's attack. Yeon-Myeong, standing in the epicenter of the explosion, braced himself against the overwhelming force, the ground beneath his feet quaking from the sheer impact. Yu-Giljun's smirk deepened as he watched the aftermath of his devastating attack. Certain that his subduing righteous divine art had overwhelmed Yeon-Myeong. The technique, based on amplifying his true energy to a near unbeatable level, had always left his enemies in ruin. But as the dust began to settle, his expression faltered. Something was wrong. The power that should have been overwhelming was fading, the energy dissipating faster than it should. Confusion flickered in his eyes. What was happening? From within the fading explosion, a figure emerged. Yeon-Myeong moved with fluid grace, his sword glowing with an ethereal light as he cut through the remnants of Yu-Giljun's attack. With a calculated swing, Yeon-Myeong neutralized the energy, turning the tide of the battle in a single elegant motion. The shift was so sudden that Yu-Giljun barely had time to react before a slash landed across his body, the blade biting deep into his flesh. Staggering back, Yu-Giljun's hand instinctively reached for his bleeding chest, shock evident on his face. He had never expected to be struck down like this, especially not after unleashing one of his most powerful techniques. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend the nature of Yeon-Myeong's counterattack. But no explanation came to him. The precision, the power, it was something beyond what he had anticipated. Meanwhile, Yeon-Myeong's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes cold and calculating. In the heat of battle, he had gained a profound insight into his swordsmanship, a realization that came to him at the very brink of death. The struggle had pushed him to a new level, allowing him to fully unlock the potential of his sword techniques. What once felt strained and incomplete now flowed effortlessly through him, as though his blade had become an extension of his very will. He glanced briefly at his sword, feeling the newfound power coursing through him. There was no doubt in his mind anymore. He had surpassed the limits that had previously held him back. His opponent had thought this battle would be his stepping stone to greater heights. But it was Yeon-Myeong who had ascended. With a mocking edge to his gaze, Yeon-Myeong's focus returned to the battle. His sword, now sharper and deadlier than ever, glistened in the dim light of the battlefield, ready to strike once more. There would be no stepping stone today, no elevation for Yeogeljun. The fate of this fight was already sealed. One of them was going to die, and Yeon-Myeong had no intention of it being him.